to part 3 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Paying Our Respects to Mama. By Sunday afternoon, the table in Miss Martha's kitchen was loaded with dishes of food, casseroles, fried chicken, cakes and pies, and the neighbors continued to bring the food. I stuck close to Miss Martha in that crowded kitchen. There was the smell of coffee and coconut cake in the air. Miss Martha was one of the first people I could recall in my earliest memory who always had on her apron and was forever baking cookies for all us neighborhood kids, and I found comfort in being near her, especially now. That evening at bedtime, I slept with her in her warm bed, having fitful dreams of not being able to wake my mama, and of that creepy old tavern, and of Aunt Mary. But morning came, and during breakfast, Miss Martha announced that she had reached my aunt by phone and that Aunt Mary would be arriving the following morning. I began to cry, telling her I didn't want to leave. "I want to stay with you," I said. "Can I just live here?" But she only shook her head. "If it was up to me, baby, you could stay right here for the rest of your life. But your aunt is going to take you to live with her. That's what your mama wanted, and that's what we're going to do," she said. Miss Martha had me up early the next morning before my aunt arrived, and then Mr. Harvey pulled that big black touring car of hers up to the curb in front of our house, and we watched from the little front porch as he moved around to the back door of the car and opened it for Aunt Mary to step out. She was draped in a full-length fur coat with matching hat, looking very out of place in our little neighborhood. And of course, Mr. Harvey Bell was also dressed to the nines in a fine blue suit with a matching cap and white gloves. Miss Martha and I met them at the door and welcomed them in. Meanwhile, at the curb, the neighborhood men gathered around that fine automobile. The closest thing they had seen to a car like that in this neighborhood was the Veterans Day Parade, when a general and the mayor and the governor had ridden through on their way to Main Street. It was like the parting of the Red Sea as Aunt Mary stepped into Miss Martha's small living room and her perfume filled the air. I clung to Miss Martha's apron as I held my nose, and Aunt Mary peered down at me, reaching to give me a tight hug and a big kiss on the cheek, smelling just as I remembered. I stepped up and touched her coat, running my hands through the soft fur, as Miss Martha helped her to take it off and took it and laid it on our bed. Miss Martha invited Aunt Mary into the crowded kitchen, and of course all the ladies at the table stood up because it wasn't respectful for black women to sit with a white woman at a table in those days. One of the neighbor women smiled at Mr. Harvey and began fixing a plate of food for him, and he went off with that heaping plate of food to the front porch to join the other men. Miss Martha shooed me away from behind her apron strings and set a hot cup of coffee on the table for Mary, who waved her hand in the air and said, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, in my house, we all sit down together." And after that, the mood lightened and everyone took their seats again. That was one thing I'd say about Aunt Mary. She was like my mother in that one sense that she did not see color and she never followed the rules. Then Aunt Martha suggested that I go out to play with the other children for a while and said the grown-ups had to talk. It turned out Aunt Mary wanted to know what had happened with her sister. I sat on the sunny steps looking out across the backyard toward my neighbors and waved to Betty Wheeler, who came running through the garden gate to join me on the steps, where I tried to sit listening to what Miss Martha would say. Miss Martha told my Aunt Mary how I had awakened to find my mother in the bed and how I'd come to her for help. Poor little thing acted like a grown-up about the entire thing, she said. God love her soul, and despite the circumstances, it's always a pleasure having her here. She's never any trouble. Aunt Mary smiled, thanking her again for all she had done, saying she'd been busy making the arrangements for the funeral telling her that she'd be staying next door in our house and that Mr. Harvey was going to visit his sister a few blocks away. Then Miss Martha offered to get Aunt Mary some food, and she fixed her a plate, and we all sat down to eat together. I came back inside with Miss Betty, who watched my Aunt Mary intently, looking her over, and asked, in the way children do, "Why do you wear so much makeup?" Aunt Mary didn't blush or get flustered. She just looked straight at Betty and laughed as she said, "When you get as old as me, you'll have to do something to stay pretty." Everyone was quiet at breakfast the next morning, the day of the funeral. Miss Martha dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, and Aunt Mary only sipped on some coffee with a piece of dry toast. After breakfast, Aunt Mary helped me to get dressed and comb my hair. On the drive to the church, I wondered what the funeral would be like. I had never attended one before. It was sunny as we stood at the graveside, but the wind cut through my clothes like a knife, and I felt as though the tears on my cheeks would turn to ice as they fell. I clung tightly to Miss Martha's hand, and I could feel Aunt Mary's bony fingers clamping on my shoulder like a glove. It had been a very long day that seemed to go on forever, but once we were back at Miss Martha's, I changed into my play clothes again. I ate some food and went outside with my friends. And for a while, the world seemed normal, except for the absence of Mama. I could look out the window of Miss Martha's bedroom and see the lights on our little kitchen next door that evening. But of course, it was Aunt Mary over there packing up our things. She announced that a moving truck would be coming before noon the next morning, and that we would be leaving for Starlight the following day. The next morning the truck arrived, and several men moved all of our belongings out of the house, including everything in my room, and I began to cry and got very upset, saying they were taking away my things. But Miss Martha assured me that all of my things would be waiting for me when I arrived at the tavern. That evening, Aunt Mary was talking with Miss Martha and another neighbor while I was in the bathtub, and I overheard a bit of their conversation. Aunt Mary told them that our little house, the house Mama and I had shared, had been sold to the preacher's daughter and her new husband, and that the money from that sale would go into a savings account just for me. And after I got out of the bath, I went back into the kitchen, just in time to see Aunt Mary pass Miss Martha an envelope. "Go on and open it," she said, smiling, as Martha opened the envelope to find $200. She said, "I can't take this, Aunt Mary, but you've been so kind to open your home to Miss Maggie and me," she said. "That is so nice of you, Miss Martha. But you didn't have to. You didn't have to be so kind. You're a wonderful neighbor, and we love you very much." Leaving my home. Morning came, and after breakfast, I brushed my teeth, and Miss Martha ran a comb through my hair and helped me to dress. She knelt down in front of me and hugged me to her and kissed me on my cheek, tucking a piece of paper into my coat pocket, telling me not to lose it. On it was written her name and address and her telephone number. "I want you to write to me, Maggie, and tell me how you're doing. And if you ever need my help with any little thing, why, all you have to do is call," she said. Then she hugged me for the longest time as Aunt Mary came to take me to the car. She thanked Miss Martha again for everything as I said goodbyes to the neighbors before we got into the car. Then they stood watching as Mr. Harvey drove us out of our little neighborhood. I looked out at them through the back window of the car, waving goodbye until I couldn't see them any longer.